Hello, welcome to the people that are attending. Hopefully, some other people hop in as well, and it'll be recorded for um, the ones that want to watch this later or share it. So, we are gonna start off in prayer. Father Bailey, would you like to lead us?
We'll pray the prayer for the canonization of Nicholas Black Elk. Heavenly Father, Great Spirit, behold us who stand before you, singing our song of thanksgiving for Nicholas Black Elk. Faithfully he walked the sacred red road and generously witnessed the good news of our Lord Jesus Christ among the native people. We humbly ask you to hear the prayers we plead through his intercession. We ask Holy Mother Church to recognize his sanctity by acknowledging his presence among the company of saints, and as one to imitate in his zeal for the gospel. Open our hearts also to recognize the risen Christ in other cultures and peoples, to your glory and honor, through Christ our Lord. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Great. So, I'm going to introduce your two speakers today. So, Father David Bailey is a pastor of the Holy Family Catholic Church in the Diocese of Tyler, Texas. He has spent almost 30 years in Native communities across the United States. And Father Michael Carson and him host the Church in Indian Country podcast on YouTube. And they are also active speakers as they spoke in the Tech With the conference and have done a lot of different topics on Native ministry. Father Michael Carson is a priest of the Diocese of San Jose, California, and is currently working as the Assistant Director for Native American Affairs with the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. And he has been a Catholic priest for 25 years. His background included experience with Native American culture, social justice, and education. For 8 years, along with being a pastor in San Jose, Reverend Michael Carson has been volunteering his time over the summer at Christ the King, Shiprock Navajo Nation, New Mexico. In this capacity, Father Carson has been doing workshops, programs, and ministry with parishioners and staff in the Navajo Nation. So, without further ado, we are going to have Father David Bailey start us off, and then Father Carson will follow shortly after. So, feel free to take it away, Father Bailey.
So my task, as I was directed to do so by Felicitas, and I usually do pretty much everything she tells me to do, is to bring you up to speed on the historical and cultural overview of the relationship between the church and Native communities. And so, it's difficult to do that, obviously, in a short period of time. But what we can say is that we know that, unfortunately, the first contact Native people had with people who called themselves Christians wasn't particularly very impressive. Um, we are guilty on many occasions of attempting to preach Christ in a way that was most un-Christ-like. That wasn't always the case. Certainly, there were advocates for Native people early on within the church. Certainly, great men like Father Bartolome de los Casas, who described the people that he met, what we refer to as the Taino people in the Caribbean, who he met. He described them as una gente en Deus. They were a people at one with God. But, he was in the minority. Unfortunately, there was a lot more people who, especially in the church, who did believe the Native people weren't equal dignity, equal as insofar as being citizens. When Spain and the other countries that were involved with colonialism came over to the New World, immediately the first thing they said was, well, this is ours. And therefore, because it's ours, this is now an extension of our homes back in Europe. And therefore, the same rules, same law, same everything applies. And in Spain, there were certain rules with property ownership and with regard to your rights, your material rights. And one of those was that you first and foremost had to be a citizen of the country. If you weren't a citizen, then you weren't given the same respect for your rights. What was yours wasn't really protected as yours. And of course, in order to be a citizen, you had to first be a Catholic. You had to be converted into the faith. And so, unfortunately, with a lot of the first contact with the Spanish Catholics in the New World, in the Central American, Caribbean part of the world that was first, I don't want to use the word discovered, but it was where they were when they first came over to the New World. Well, unfortunately, there was a lot of debate in the church that said, well, these people that were already here, if they don't convert to our faith, then we don't respect their rights as citizens, and therefore we don't respect their property rights. We can take their stuff, we can abuse them, we can force them into forced labor. And so that was unfortunately the first impression or the first encounter that a lot of Native people had with people that called themselves Christian in the United States, in the mainstream society. Or, I'm sorry, in the mainland U.S. So first encounters, Columbus and his guys, they were down in the Dominican Republic and the Caribbean in that area. But by the time people first start coming to the United States, of course, these aren't Catholics, but they're still Christians. And so there was this immediately, as settlement started happening, as westward expansion started happening, um, natives are encountering these people from these other countries, but they're also encountering their religion. And one of the things that natives noticed was the fact that there was such diverse, not only difference but disharmony. There was friction between the different denominations, and so you would have people coming into their land and saying, "We're going to build a church," and they might say, "Oh, well, yeah, well, we helped so and so build his church," and they're like, "Well, no, 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 his church is no good. You have to come to our church." And so the denominations, the warring friction between the denominations, was something that also further left a really bad impression with Native people. And so you have people like Saint Joseph, sorry, Chief Joseph. Chief Joseph was a Nez Perce leader. If you know the book "I Will Fight No More Forever," that was Chief Joseph. Chief Joseph, his father, um, accepted a form of Protestantism in his life, and so Joseph was named after Saint Joseph by his Nez Perce Christian father. But by the time of Joseph's life, as an adult, the relationship that their tribe had with the churches, with all of the churches, had become so unpleasant to them that they really cut off all ties and all connections with any churches. And so Chief Joseph, he made a comment about the differing uh, denominations and how we fought amongst each other. And he said this quote. He said, "We," speaking as chief of his people, he said, "We do not want churches because they will teach us to quarrel about God. We do not want to learn that. We may quarrel with men sometimes about things on this earth, but we never quarrel about God. We do not want to learn that." In that statement, there's a whole lot of things that you can take from it. One of them is, he said, "We may quarrel with men sometimes about things on this earth, but we never quarrel about God." In that statement is implicit the the idea that Native people knew a monotheistic creator God prior to the arrival of Europeans. And it is a fact that they did. The vast majority of Native communities, Native cultures in the United States and Canada and Central and South America, the vast majority of them are monotheistic. This idea of polytheism, which is certainly true with some of the Native Hawaiians and their culture. But with Native Americans, that wasn't usually the case. They were usually monotheistic creator believers. They believed in a monotheistic creator God who was not only an all encompassing creator, but it was somebody that they had a paternal, familial relationship with. So the example being the Lakota people who use the word Tonkashila to both mean my biological grandfather, but also as a word for God, Tonkashila, grandfather, which is only one generation removed from us saying, "Our Father who art in heaven." So they had these concepts early on. So when they saw Christians, initially, it wasn't always under the best of circumstances. So in my diocese, I'm in what is 100% of the land base that my diocese occupies, was traditionally the land of the Caddo Indian people, all of whom live. Well, I can't say all of them. Most of whom live in Oklahoma now. They were relocated to Oklahoma, but the Caddo Indians were in my diocese, and in Texas, the church began in Texas all the way back as far back as 1698. 1698, when the churches were established in East Texas as an expansion of Spanish control in central Mexico and what they called Nueva España, which we now call Mexico City, and so the Spanish, finding out that the French explorer De La Salle had been in East Texas, and they were like, "Well, that's our territory. We need to send some of our troops up there to make sure those French guys, get out, we're gonna go, we're gonna go mark our territory." Basically, is what they said. So they sent a military expedition with soldiers and with priests, Franciscans, who came up into the Caddo land, and the idea was that they were going to put garrisons and outposts there, military outposts, but with missions. And through those missions, they wanted to reach the native people through their hearts and minds and cultivate a relationship. And one of the things that they thought was, well, we'll teach them something. Well, there's a few problems with that. One is we were going to teach them about God, and the natives were like, "Yeah, we already know God, and you guys don't really live by a very good example of God anyway. So we're not really sure how well you know Him." And secondly, they said, "Well, we're going to teach you how to be farmers." Well, the Caddo were agricultural people; they were agricultural experts, and they laughed at them. And they're like, "Not only are you not going to teach us how to farm, but we're going to tell you that your techniques are way outdated. We got better skills than that." So whatever it was that they were going to offer them, it wasn't really something that appealed to them. But in addition to that, the soldiers that were brought with these garrisons who were going to stay behind, a lot of times they caused a lot of problems. Going into these villages as young men away from their families for a long period of time might be prone to do, molesting the women. There was a lot of cases of these women being abused sexually, so much so that in my diocese, Father Antonio Marhill, who has a cause for canonization, he's the Venerable Antonio Marhill, originally from Spain. He was a Spanish Franciscan. He established some of the missions in my diocese, and one of the things that he decreed was that all men who stayed behind in the garrisons with the missions had to be married men, and they had to bring their wives with them. And in one case, in a parish that was built on what was a mission quite some time ago, or I should say, quite some distance from my parish. They're in my diocese, but they're quite far from my parish. But in that mission, there was on record a roster of all the people who were there. And in one particular case, they had a guy who was a soldier. He was made to bring his wife and his mother-in-law because apparently he was particularly incorrigible. And so Father Antonio Marhill said, "You're bringing your wife, you're bringing your wife, you're bringing your wife, and you're bringing your mother-in-law." Which is funny, but unfortunately, it spoke to a wider problem that wasn't always as respected by church leaders. And so historically, there was a really deep mistrust, to say the very least. Now, getting into the cultural side of things, I'll share a story before I turn the time over to Father Carson. But before I do that, there's a few things that we have to say to establish about the cultural differences. For one thing, is as I'm saying, natives knew God. They knew the same God that we know. They didn't know He had a son, and they were usually willing to accept that when they heard it. For example, the Lakota people thought that Jesus must have been a member of their tribe because everything they heard of Him said, this man follows the exact same code of conduct that's expected of a man. He's generous, he's humble, he loves his mother, he was courageous, he fought against injustice. He must have been an Indian man. And their idea of the crucifixion with their practice of the sun dance, it made perfect sense to them. You offer the flesh for the benefit of the entire world, for the benefit of your people. And so there was a priest by the name of Father de Smet. And Father de Smet was a Belgian Jesuit. And he came into Lakota communities at a time when they were at war with the United States and vice versa. So he went into Sitting Bull's camp when Sitting Bull's Hunkpapa Lakota were still at war with the United States government and with white settlers in general. And these guys, in a time of hostilities, Father DeSmet goes into Sitting Bull's village with no fear whatsoever. And so for Lakota people, that was one thing that they noticed really quickly was he's a brave man, and they respected that. But the other thing was he sat and he listened. And it was told to me by people on a different Lakota reservation that one of the things that the Lakota people in those days admired about him was that he would go into their ceremonies and he would be completely fully present. He wouldn't be judgmental. He wouldn't be saying, "Oh, this is devil worship." He wouldn't be, fidgeting or looking at his watch and seeing like, "When is this thing gonna be over?" He was completely present, and he would completely enter into prayer with them. And he made such an impression that Sitting Bull, who at one point made comments that basically said, "I would never disrespect my mouth by making it speak English," and then never learned English, supposedly. Sitting Bull was still curious enough about this Belgian Jesuit that he learned enough French, and Father de Smet learned enough Lakota for them to communicate. And as a little known fact, Sitting Bull, the great Sitting Bull, was baptized as a Catholic by Father de Smet at the end of their encounters with each other. A lot of things that Father de Smet did correctly have been done incorrectly by most Christians who have encountered Native people. One is there's always, not always, but there's often an element of judgment on our part. You shouldn't speak your language. Well, that's a problem. That's a problem for a lot of reasons that we don't have time to go into. There's something wrong with what you believe. That comes from an arrogance that we have as Christians. Especially as Catholic Christians, we believe truthfully and rightfully so that we have the fullness of truth revealed to us, that Jesus Christ is the fullness of truth. You may know God, but the fullness of truth is he had a son, and his son paid with his life the sacrifice for our redemption. That's the fullness of truth. But to say that we have the fullness of truth is not to say that other people don't have some element of the truth that they already know about. God has revealed himself to all ages and to all men precisely to cultivate the land and to or the environment so that people would be able to accept Christ when they encountered him. And so unfortunately, in the cases with a lot of some of the church people, whether they be from the boarding schools or from some of the religious orders, they were very quick to say, "Well, your beliefs aren't correct." Well, that's not a true statement. That's an assessment that they made based on the idea that, well, we have the one true faith. So therefore, if you're not a part of our faith, then your faith is wrong. If they had listened like Father de Smet did when he went into their ceremonies, they would have realized, we worship the same God. We have always worshiped the same God. As Father Carson says, the Holy Spirit was alive and well in the Western Hemisphere long before Europeans got here. So cultural things. The first thing that you have to know about the cultural elements of Native communities is this. Number one, Natives still exist. They do. Number two, they are not at all, not even close, are they all the same. The difference between the Navajo and the Lakota is just as pronounced, is just as vast, is as the difference between the Germans and the Italians. The Germans and the Italians are both European countries. And furthermore to that, the distance between those two countries isn't as far as certain points on the map in the United States. In fact, there are 574 federally recognized Native American nations just in the United States alone. That doesn't include Canada or Mexico or Guatemala. And it also doesn't include the Native nations which aren't currently recognized, either because they were decimated through cultural genocide, physical genocide, actual genocide, or because they're no longer recognizable as a separate cultural group of people. For example, there's tribes in North Carolina, the Halawasaponi, the Mattaponi, the Upper Mattaponi, the Pamunkey. They were all part of the Powhatan Confederacy. They're recognized by their state as tribes, but they're not federally recognized. So 574 is what is still left and what is recognizable as Native and federally recognized just in the United States, not including Canada. They're vastly different. you can't say they when you talk about native people because they are vastly different. They're as different as Germans to Italians and the Swiss to people from Iowa. All right, they're vastly different. And so when you go into native communities, you have to first of all know that you don't know much. You probably really don't know anything. You have to go into native communities and accept with humility that I'm here with a people who are every bit equal to me, who have their own beliefs and their own knowledge and their own thoughts about the same God that I worship. And I'm going to learn from them. Unfortunately, we typically do go into communities like that with a bit of arrogance. Well, we're going to teach you something. Just like the Franciscans wanted to teach the Caddo how to farm, which is laughable. Caddos were amazing farmers, and the Franciscans weren't that good at it, apparently. So, again, well, we're going to teach you something. Instead, the attitude should be, what can we learn from each other? In the night, I think it was around the 1970s, early part of 1970s. There was a book written by a guy by the name of Thomas Males about Frank Foolsgrove. Frank Foolsgrove, who died, I think, in the year 1979. And so he was a link between that old era, the old teepee days, and the reservation era. He was also a nephew of Nicholas Black Elk. Frank Foolsgrove was also a respected ceremonial man, a holy man, a medicine man. Frank Foolsgrove was also Catholic. And Frank Foolsgrove said this, and this is a quote from the book by Thomas Males called Foolsgrove. Frank Foolsgrove says this: I am still, now, even though he led ceremonies and went to, he did all the ceremonies, sun dances, and fasting and sweat lodge and all these things. He said, I am still a practicing Catholic. He says, I am still a practicing Roman Catholic, and I go to Mass once or twice a month, and I receive Holy Communion when I can. My wife, Kate, whom I married in 1958, is also a Roman Catholic, and we attend worship services together. At the same time, we live according to the traditional religious beliefs and customs of our people, and we find few problems with the differences between the two. And now, Frank Foolsgrove, as I said, was the nephew of Nicholas Black Elk, the older Nicholas Black Elk, who is cause for canonization right now. Frank Foolsgrove asked him at one point, he asked his uncle, you're this great medicine man of our people. Why did you convert to Catholicism? And he said that his uncle told him that he was always interested in the teachings of the Roman Catholic Church. And so he spent many hours talking to the priests about it. And when he and I were discussing it one day, Black Elk told me that he had decided that the Sioux, or the Lakota, religious way of life was pretty much the same as that as the Christian, and that there was no reason that we should change, but rather we should pick up the Christian teachings and work with them in addition to our own ways, so that in the end, both would be better. That's so profound, this joint two roads theory, the two roads theory of Nicholas Black Elk. We're on the same path, going in the same direction. We're on the same journey. We have to respect each other as having equal dignity. And so, unfortunately, a lot of times we have people that go into reservations to do ministry, and there's either an ignorance of so many things about their culture. There's an ignorance of the history that the first encounters that those people had with Christians, in most cases, wasn't very good. And then there's also an ignorance into certain cultural norms. And so I'll briefly share this story, and then I'll concede my time to Father Carson. I was back in, I want to say, the mid 1990s. I was in Montana with one of the tribes that I spend a lot of time with. And I was invited to participate in one of their ceremonies in which you go into a teepee and you stay there all night long. And people take turns all the way around, praying out loud and singing and just chanting. And they pray. And it was so profound. It was so beautiful, so moving. Cultural norms. You have to know cultural norms. Or more to the point, you have to be humble and know that you don't know cultural norms, and be humble to be taught, to learn these things. Otherwise, you'll offend people. Natives are really big on humility, and they're not big on people that go in their communities and talk a lot. And so I happened to be in this teepee meeting, this ceremony, And the whole night long, the people prayed and they were praying. And they had a staff with eagle feathers and they would pass it around. And when you had it, it was kind of like having the stick to talk. And every time it would come to me, I would pass it to the next person because I didn't know their language. I didn't know their culture, their songs. I didn't know their chants. I didn't know any of it. But I would pass it on to the next person. And that went on all night. I was there with another person that I had traveled with, and we had both been invited into the ceremony. And at some point, he had gotten sick and he needed to leave. But after he had gotten outside, he realized that I had the keys to his vehicle and he couldn't get inside and lay down. And so he appeared towards the morning time at the beginning of the entrance of the teepee. And he was indicating to me that he wanted the keys to the vehicle. Now, the ceremony's still going on. Somebody was in prayer. Between me and the door to the teepee, there was a guy there with this staff with the eagle feathers, holding it and praying, really, really intently praying. And he was really kind of getting animated, saying, "Hey, I need my keys. I need my keys." So I thought, in the interest of everybody here, let me just throw the keys to the guy and he'll go and get in his vehicle and he'll lay down and he'll leave us alone. So I did that. And it was the exact wrong thing to do. I had broken a few cultural taboos in that situation. They knew that I didn't know that, but I still had done it. I had done something wrong. For one thing, for this particular tribe and this particular ceremony, I had thrown keys in a counterclockwise direction. And I learned very quickly, never throw your keys counterclockwise in a teepee, at least with this one tribe. And so that was one thing I had done wrong. The other thing was, in my throwing the keys out to the guy, it passed in front of the man who was praying, who had the staff and the eagle feathers, and there was a fire burning there, and he was in a communication with God, praying at that moment. But I had thrown something that came into his line, if you will, that's considered disrespectful. It's kind of like when I'm in the chapel about 10 minutes before mass and I'm trying to pray very quietly and someone comes up and taps me on the shoulder, "Father Bailey." I'm like, "What? What do you want?" It's kind of like that. What I should have done, I later found out, was take the keys, hand them to the guy to my left, and indicate, "Would you please send those around person to person until it gets to that guy out there?" That's what I should have done. I didn't know that. They knew I didn't know that. But nonetheless, I had broken some rules. But they also had seen that I had been praying with them all night long. I sat there and I prayed and I didn't fidget and I didn't ask, I didn't see what time it was and I didn't ask any questions. I sat there and I just prayed with them. And as they were praying, I was really, truly into it. I felt it. I felt it so strong. It was one of those most powerful moments I felt in that time. One of the most powerful moments I experienced. And I had a deep appreciation. Didn't understand a lot what was going on at that time, but a deep appreciation for the serious sanctity, the holiness that was on display in the prayers and the songs, in the tears that they prayed with. I was so moved by it. And they must have seen that because at some point when the guy had finished and the staff with the eagle feathers came and I took it to pass it to the next guy next to me, the guy running the ceremony indicated for me to stop. Now, in that entire ceremony, they hadn't spoken English. I know they knew how to, but they prefer not to. They do their prayers in their native language. The guy told me to stop. And he, in front of everybody there, he gently corrected me on what I had done wrong, how I had broken social protocol, and how I had done something that was incorrect. But he was very gentle about it. And then after that, he honored me. And everybody nodded and everybody said, "Yeah, yeah." He said, "But we're glad that you're here. You've prayed with us all night long, and we see that. And that's good. And we thank you for being with us." And we left on that note. So I share that story for a few reasons. One is because it gives you a good idea when you come among Native communities. Forget what you think you know. You don't know. And be humble about it. Because I accepted the correction. I accepted that I had done something wrong. I didn't understand it at the time, but I accepted it. And I even instinctively knew it. So I accepted the correction. But his observation was true. I had entered into prayer with him deeply, sincerely, with my whole heart, all night long. They saw that. They recognized it. They acknowledged it. And I left that encounter in a really good way. And with some of those people, I actually still know some of them. I actually began relationships with some of their families, and I'm still up there 30 years later, at least once or twice a year, and people still remember me. That was a good time, but it started with me making a mistake, being corrected for it, but then having something else acknowledged and me being humble enough to accept that criticism. When we go amongst Native people, we're not teaching them so much as we are learning together with them. It is a joint journey, a journey of equals, learning from each other.
Very good. Thank you, Father Bailey. Appreciate it. From Lakota, we go now to the Navajo, the Dene. I spent some on and off, some 8 years with the Navajo. Kind of talk about first kind of Navajo 101. You understand being a minister to natives by understanding culture and where that culture comes from. And then, of course, my observations of the important part of working with the Navajo. So I'm going to go ahead and share screen because I do have a PowerPoint here. First, as Father Bailey just talked about, is before going into working with Native communities, Indigenous communities, there's got to be some awareness of what you're doing because you're just going to go through or work with the natives without any awareness, then you're not going to be very effective. So in terms of working with the natives, first, when we talk about mission, think about what it means to be in mission, because there's a lot of different ideas of exactly what it means to be mission. Father Bailey talked about one idea. It says you're going to the Native Indigenous communities and you're going to teach them something that they don't know, or presumably they don't know, or perhaps they do know. But the idea, that teacher model, which I don't think is very effective, because it's a one way. It's like in a dialogue where you're doing all the talking and not doing the listening, then you're not going to be a very effective teacher, or even somebody who really embraces the people or even the culture. There's missions liberation. I'm here to help you remove all things that make you less human. We're going to work together. That's one aspect of mission. Sometimes it's a vast aspect or a majority aspect, but it's one aspect. Mission is mutual assistance of a local church. We find ourselves in mission everywhere in a dialogue with others to find what Christ has for us. So what Father Bailey talked about, kind of the equal footing, or we're all on the same page here. We're all finding God together. So we're going to learn from each other. Mission is church. The church is always in need of renewing itself. Once Christian parts of the globe need to be re-evangelized, those parts of the globe that have an obligation to help out those who do not. I always talk about I'm a missionary to Washington, D.C., where we find a lot of pagans or those who do not know Christ, although they do say they know Christ. So the idea, wherever you find yourself, you're a missionary. Where you're a missionary to the Navajo or the Dene or the Native communities, or even in Washington, D.C., or even in other parts of the country. I think wherever you find yourself, you are a missionary. You're here to carry out Christ's mission. And mission as fulfillment. Christ is the ultimate fulfillment, is that all cultures have virtues, all cultures have sins. And it's the awareness from your own culture, where are the virtues, where are the sins? And when you go into a different culture, being that awareness, where are the virtues and where are the sins? So you can expand on the virtues and work with people to remove the sin. But first, remember that all cultures are the same thing. They have virtues and sins. And that humility that Father Bailey talked about becomes very important as a missionary. Okay, and we'll go specifically to the Navajo. The most important part of understanding the Dene, which is another word for Navajo, that's what they call themselves. Dene is just a Navajo word, it just means people. So the most important part is understanding, especially the land where the Navajo are and have been for thousands of years. Because if you don't understand their connection to the land, then you're, of course, not going to understand the people. That circle is a little larger than the reservation itself. The Navajo Reservation is the largest reservation in terms of land in the United States. But that is the ancestral home of the Navajo, and they've been there for thousands, if not millions of years in that particular region. Okay, this is a kind of a blown up version of that great circle. This is the districts of the Navajo Nation. One aspect of the Navajo Nation is about the size of West Virginia. So there's a lot of different typography. Mostly it's high desert, but there's also mountains and forests. So they have bears and other wildlife too. So on what we call the Colorado Plateau, it ranges from 5,000 to 7,000 feet. The weather is moderate, but because it's that elevation, it does snow for most of the reservation. It is also a very important point. It's also one of the most sparsely populated places in the United States. A traffic jam is when you go 100 miles and see one car. That you can go 100 miles, and I've done this from Shiprock to Gallup down the freeway, and you not even see a house for 100 miles or 75 miles. So keep that in mind that this place, there's not a lot of people living there. The most important part of living with the Navajo is the idea of four. There are four colors, four directions, and especially four sacred mountains. So you go to the Navajo Nation and talk about church. When you talk about church, you're talking about the area between these four mountains. And there's two mountains actually outside the reservation itself. But the church themselves is not a church building. It's this gigantic area between these four sacred mountains. So when I talk about church, that's what they're talking about. And that's an interesting concept to think about, is that a church can be 200 to 300 miles apart and not one particular building. And for Navajo, the land they talk about is Dine Barakai, which just means Navajo land. And that's what, again, when I talk about church, that's what we're talking about. Let's go through some pictures briefly. This is the West. You guys seen it in some cowboy movies. This is Monument Valley, which is inside the reservation, but it's actually in Utah. This little part of the reservation sticks into Utah. So this is the West. North is again in Utah. This is National Bridges Park, which is a beautiful park. The South, this is the Window Rock. This is the headquarters of the Navajo Nation. It's like they're Washington, D.C. This is the East. This is Snake River Valley. And it's also a very big, beautiful state park. Okay, let's before going first of all into culture, you have to know the land, especially in dealing with Navajo or any other indigenous communities. You have to know their history, because then you can understand their cultural elements or where these cultural elements come from. As Father Bailey talked about, when we talk about the Native communities, it's like talking about Europeans. They're very diverse in terms of not only language, but also in terms of history. The Navajo themselves are classified with the Athabascans, a language group. Indigenous communities are usually classified by what language they speak or what language they're related to. The Navajo Athabascans. Now that's a very important part, because Athabascans are from Western Canada and Alaska. The first time that the Navajo had expertise or even some meetings with the Northern Canada's people from the natives of Northern Canada, they actually could understand each other because they both spoke a form of Athabascans. So obviously the Navajo came from Western Canada, from Alaska, came into to this part of Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah, but they're classified as Athabascans. Why that is important? Because there's no other cultural family around them that are Athabascans. Most of them have a different language group, and they're from more of an ancient culture, and it's called the Anasazi. A lot of natives don't like the term Anasazi. Anasazi is actually a Navajo word. It means the ancestors of our relatives, the enemies of our relatives. So again, it's not a good word. A lot of people just use the word ancient Puebloans. These are from the Pueblo people that lived there several millions of years in that area. So Pueblos, the Hopis, were all part of that different culture group or language group, and the Navajo are certainly set apart by that. Okay. One of the other cultural elements with the Navajo is the Spanish period. As Father Bailey talked about, the early missionaries and soldiers came up from Mexico, and they first colonized or worked with the Pueblos in the Rio Grande Valley. But for a variety of reasons, which I'm not going to get into because it's an entire lecture, the Pueblos did a revolt against the Spanish in the Rio Grande Valley in New Mexico. What happened was the Reconquista, or the Spanish conquested New Mexico, and from that, a lot of Pueblos went to the west, to Navajo lands, and integrated with Navajo. So a lot of cultural elements are actually from the Pueblos, such as the jewelry, the molding of silver. All that comes from Pueblos that the Navajo has taken up. The Navajo actually they do very well in terms of imitating different skills and abilities, and that's one of the things that not only they learned from the Spanish and the Pueblos, but also from the American period. Okay, then we get into some difficulties here with the U.S. period. This is a picture of Chief Manuelito, who's kind of the leading figure of the Navajo. What happened is, and for a variety of reasons, the Navajo continued to steal sheep and stuff from the Spanish and the Mexicans, and then when the U.S. took over New Mexico and Arizona, they wanted to stop that. So they hired this person, my namesake, Kit Carson. The problem with the Navajo is that when armies came in, they went into their canyons and hid until the armies went away. So that was a problem facing Kit Carson of how to defeat the Navajo. So what Kit Carson did, in fact, was one of the early persons who did this, what we call now a scorched earth, is he went in with his troops. And of course, the Navajo went into the canyon areas and hid. But what Kit Carson did was he took all the sheep, all the horses, and cut down all the fruit trees. So the Navajo literally were starved to death. And eventually they had to come out of their canyons and dwellings. And this is what they call a long walk. So what they established 2 forts, the U.S. did. When the starving Navajo came out of their canyon areas, they located them in the 2 forts, but then they didn't stay there. The U.S. government wanted to have a reservation far to the east, and the border between Texas and New Mexico was called Bosque Redondo. So that's why the Navajo, all of them were transported. It was called the long walk, and they were transported to this reservation, Bosque Redondo. Unfortunately, it's a desert area, but also the soil is very alkaline, so they can't grow anything. So not only were they starving from their traditional lands, but in this new area, they were also starving because they couldn't grow anything. And Navajo were traditionally raising sheep, not farmers, so it became a difficult problem. And a lot of them were dying off, not only for the long walk, but also for the gathering at Bosque Redondo, which is on the border of Texas and Mexico. So it became a problem, realizing the Navajo were facing extinction as a people. It became a problem with the federal government to decide what to do. So there's some talk with the federal government of exactly what to do with the Navajo, and there was thought of just letting them starve to death, and they were dying out. There's thought about putting them into Oklahoma, which a lot of other nations have been forced to go to. But there's also some talk about allowing them to go back to their traditional lands. Eventually, the idea of going back to the traditional lands, because nobody wanted that area, it's all desert anyway, that kind of ran out, was agreed upon by the U.S. government. And from that, they set up a treaty, allowing them to go back. Their lands they were considerably reduced, but they set up this treaty, allowing them to set up a reservation and additional lands between the borders of Arizona and Mexico and Utah in the Four Corners area. And that's the treaty. And the treaty day is actually still celebrated with the Navajo even today. Okay, that's me. That's it's like the natives live in teepees or in other dwellings. For the Navajo, they live in hogans, or did at one time live in hogans. That's why the Navajo are very different than the surrounding indigenous or natives, because they don't live in hogans. It is 8-sided. It has a dirt floor that's open at the top, and this is again a traditional hogan. Some Navajo still live in hogans. Most do not, of course. Okay, from hogans, the U.S. established these trading posts. Hubble is also from the telescope family. He was a famous astronomer, but he also has a family that was in these trading posts. They set up the trading posts, and there's just a museum where the trading posts were. And then from that time, the Navajo eventually took over these from the whites of the different trading posts. Okay, let's go into the Catholic influence, because Catholic influence is very important, because actually the Navajo even still today have a very good opinion of the Catholic Church, because unlike other histories of the Catholic Church, the Franciscans really worked with the Navajo, as Father Bailey talked about, trying to understand their culture first rather than evangelizing. And they're actually, the Navajo were evangelized quite late 1800s by Cincinnati Franciscans and also by St. Catherine Drexel. So again, they learned from history of how to adapt. All the Franciscans learned the Navajo language. In fact, Father Weber, who's the center one there, is the first person who actually translated the Navajo language and put it into English and did an alphabet for the Navajo language. So he's also famous for that, and from the government too. And St. Catherine Drexel, she established the St. Michael Church and School, which still is operating today. It's a primary school and a high school, and it still goes strong. They teach very much Navajo culture and also Navajo language. So it's a very powerful school, and it's the only high school left on the Navajo reservation. And there's the original building of Father Weber, as he worked with the Navajo in order to, again, to understand the culture, to evangelize. And Father Weber also worked with the federal government to increase the size of the Navajo nation and the Navajo reservation. So I think he, through his time, increased to 3 or 4 times as the original time. So again, that's why there's a great appreciation for not only the Catholics, but the Franciscans, even to this day. And that's, again, St. Michael's, the original. It's not the original church, but it's the original site of the original church on the Navajo Nation. St. Michael's Indian School, again, it's a great school. Okay, and then there's a lot of cultural elements for the Navajo. And so we work with the Navajo, you have to understand that. First, they're very much family, tribe, and clan, and not so much the Navajo Nation as an entity or even as a government. That's why they get into a lot of problems. In fact, kind of a cute story is when the U.S. finally set them all into a reservation, they said that, like other tribes, they need to have a tribal council. So they kind of forced them into tribal council at Window Rock. So all the Navajo people came together, leaders came together and took the first vote. And the first vote was to dissolve the tribal council, and they all went home. And the government was not impressed by that, and they had them all again, gather them all again. But that's the idea that a lot of influence, a lot of effort is on the tribe, or not on the tribe, but on the clan. For a family, the first thing you announce rather than your name is your clan, where your clan comes from, and also from your family. Because I guess Window Rock is headquarters of the Navajo Nation today. This is the head Navajo Nation. There's a lot of problems. I won't get into that, but there's a drinking and a lot of poverty. The Navajo Nation has some of the poorest counties in the United States for a variety of reasons, which I don't have time to get into. But there's a lot of concerns that I can talk about a lot. Okay, Navajo creation. There's a lot of things about the Navajo religion that I don't get into just because it's really complex. But they do have a creation story. This is the creation story. They go from first world, the first man, first woman, going to the second world, the third world, and the fourth world, and eventually get into the earth, where the earth is now. And then there are 3 major gods: changing woman, born of water, and monster slayer, which I'm not going to get into. But I can't talk about the ways. The ways are the traditional Navajo religion. Now, if you think about a religion, right, you go to church or you go to church building on Sunday or day of week and you worship God. That's not the Navajo. What the Navajo see as religion, as kind of more of a doctor, is that when you're having problems or concerns, then you take in or you embrace the religion in order to address those concerns. So, I know this because I have a good friend on the Navajo Nation, and his uncle was an atali, which is a holy man of the Navajo, and we talk about their religion and how it is integrated. But first of all, if you have a concern or a problem or a difficulty, you'll go to what's called a crystal gazer. And a crystal gazer will write you kind of a prescription and saying, this is the way you need. And I forgot how many ways there are. There are some 370 ways, I believe. The 4 are blessing way, enemy way, evil, and ghost. Okay. So the crystal gazer will tell you what way you need. Then you go to an atali. An atali will, depends on what way you need, will again do the ceremony. Usually they put a sand painting on the floor, a dirt floor, and then they would do chanting. Sometimes they wrap you up in a blanket. Sometimes there's a sweat lodge before and after. And then the atali will perform this way. Depends on the way. Some ways can last for an hour. Some can last for an entire day. It depends on what way you need. And in order to be an athlete, there's of course not a university. It's an apprenticeship. You have to work with an athlete for some 20, 30 years in order to, again, to be a full athlete and do these ways. So it's fascinating, especially for a enemy way or an evil way. All the evilness is soaked into the painting, the sand painting on the floor, and then the sand painting is brushed away, just symbolizing the removal of all the evil spirits that's gone on to the sand painting. And it was interesting that I was celebrating Mass at the church, and then I just asked the altar server what he's going to do after Mass. He says, I'm going to the enemy way. My brother just came back from Afghanistan, and he needs to go to a way. So, wow, that's interesting. We just talked about what way he was going to. But for the altar server, he had no problem with the going to a way and his Catholic faith. They were intertwined. It was kind of one and the other, and it's kind of both. And that he has double blessing because he was Catholic and also participating in the ancient Navajo religion. Okay. Here's my parish, Shiprock. Dun, 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 dun. It's a nice parish. There's a big gigantic rock in the middle of the valley. It's a very beautiful place. That's an extinct volcano. The Navajo themselves believe there's a gigantic bird that kind of nosedived in the desert, and their tail feathers are sticking up. That's what they believe. This Shiprock. There's the parish hall. There's our parish hall. Our great gift to Navajo, our bingo, and they do bingo at the parish hall every night or twice a week. So there's the statue of Saint Kateri Tekakwitha. This is again going back from the road. This road actually goes to Farmington, which is about 30, 40 miles away. This is the San Juan River. It goes through the town. It goes on to the Grand Canyon and the river, the bridge over. A lot of fast food restaurants, stuff like that. And then I'll talk about a little bit about Hujo because it's a very important part of the Navajo belief, and actually very important part of the culture. Now, you think about for many Christians, Catholics, or whatever, they think about good or evil or sin and virtue. That's not really a concept with the Navajo. They have more of a concept of things being balanced and out of balance. And the object when things get out of balance is to bring things back into balance. Now, that seems to maybe a subtle difference, but it's a very important difference. So we talk about what brings things into harmony. It is all the things that a culture can do. For instance, and this never happened to me, but the pastor would talk about his experience working with the Navajo. In our culture, if a pastor does something wrong or people don't like, our first response is to write to pastor. If that doesn't work, write to the bishop or even get parishioners to send emails and talk about it and maybe to protest outside the church. That would be things out of balance. That's why Navajo would not approach it that way. What Navajo would do, then it would do, and again, this did not happen to me, so I'm not talking personal stories, but I know this would happen. That the Navajo, if a pastor did something really bad and really wrong and hurt a lot of people, what they would do is they would invite the pastor for dinner. And it wouldn't be everybody. It would be the mothers and the grandmothers, sometimes the great-grandmothers, because they're the ones who have the authority in the family or even in the society. And then after inviting, they would feed them, sheep, of course, maybe Navajo tacos, stuff like that. And the Navajo would talk about their children or their grandchildren, raising sheep, all these things that really don't apply to the church. And then when the dessert comes around, the oldest grandmother would say, well, there's a concern here that we're having about what's going on in this parish. And these are the things that we decided that really would help both you and the parish and ourselves. What do you think about that? Now, that becomes very important because once the grandmother says that, if you don't take her seriously, your effectiveness in the parish ends right there. You know to go to your church or go to a neighboring church. You're trying to get people to participate in your programs. They won't. They would cut you off immediately if you don't take them seriously. If you say, well, okay, I understand that, and I'll do what you ask. Sounds like a good approach to me. And then you have entrance into that culture, into the parish family. So the subtlety of the culture is very, very important in order to be effective, in order to bring Christ's message and again, to learn from the people in the culture, knowing that, as Father Bailey said, that God has already been there, and to learn from that and transform yourself. Anyway, there's a lot of things in terms of harmony, being balanced and out of balance. That's basically it in terms of my presentation. I go on about that, but that's more out of the Navajo, the Dene. That's probably the most important concept of things being balanced and out of balance.
Thank you, Father Carson. That was very informative in learning about the Navajo Nation, and Father Bailey, you too, on your cultural history and whatnot. So this was our presentation too on the last day of November for Native American Heritage Month. We wanted to do something to share with everyone about Native ministry and such.